Agenda?
I move we approve the agenda.
Second.
Moved in second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion passes. Next item is consent agenda.
Move to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Moved in second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion passes. Is there anybody here from the public that'd like to speak to something that's not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to our first agenda item under special reports and presentations, Arbor Day proclamation. Roger? Do you want to talk to the council a little bit about Arbor Day first?
I have nothing to say.
Okay. Well, we'll read this. This
We
has
have
plenty-
trees.
This has plenty to say.
Something about Nebraska.
It does. I remember that. Whereas in 1872, J. Sterling Morton proposed to the Nebraska Board of Agriculture that a special day be set aside for the planting of trees. And whereas this holiday, called Arbor Day, was first observed with the planting of more than 1 million trees in Nebraska, Arbor Day is now observed throughout the nation and the world. And whereas trees reduce the erosion of our precious topsoil by wind and water, cut heating and cooling costs, moderate the temperature, clean the air, produce oxygen, and prohibit habitat for wildlife. And whereas trees are a renewable resource giving us paper, wood for our homes, fuel for our fires, and countless other wood products. And trees in our city increase property values, enhance the economic vitality of business areas, and beautify our community. And whereas trees, wherever they are planted, are a source of joy and spiritual renewal. And whereas the city of Baldwin City has been recognized as a Tree City USA by the National Arbor Day Foundation and desires to continue its tree planting practices. Now I therefore, Casey Simno, Mayor of the City of Baldwin City, with the support of the City Council, do hereby proclaim Friday, April 28th, 2023 as Arbor Day in the City of Baldwin City. I call upon all residents of Baldwin City to celebrate Arbor Day and to support efforts to protect our trees and woodlands. And further, I urge all citizens to plant trees to gladden the heart and promote the well-being of this and future generations. So, thank you for everything the tree board does for us, right?
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Should we get past the mic?
Pass the motor.
Oh, she's gonna go this way.
Whichever.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. First item under old business is the substation authorization of general obligation bonds. Glenn, do you,
I don't know Roger's last name, but
Roger Boyd? He heads up the tree. Glenn, do you want to just give the council a brief synopsis of this?
Yeah, it's really brief. We approved going forward with the substation. This is a resolution you have to pass in order to enable the sale of bonds to support that construction. That's it. It's the first step in that process.
Is there anybody here from the public like to speak to this agenda item? Seeing none, council discussion? Not, I don't entertain a motion.
how much,
Oh, go ahead.
how much we're gonna go for?
4.2 million.
Is that what it was?
4 million, yeah.
For the-
Do we know what interest is on it yet?
This is for the bidding of it, I believe.
That's just with me.
Right, Glenn?
Correct, yeah. This enables them to go out and actually do the bid, which probably will be in a couple of months.
It'll be brought back after that's done.
Right. And you'll have approval of that.
I move to pass a resolution to authorize the sale of general obligation bonds to pay for the construction of a new electric substation.
I'll second.
Been moved and second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion passes. Next item under the agenda is the application of new code to existing buildings when an addition is built. Dakota.
This is a memo I drafted for the council after our last meeting. Councilmember Smith had some questions regarding what would happen, how the code's applied, and this would be the International Building Code. It's applied when additions are put on to existing structures, and whether or not an addition to an existing structure require the existing structure to come up to the current code that had been built before the adoption of the code. I think in my memo, tried to keep it brief and simple because I'll be fair, the answer is you don't need to come up to code, but there are a lot of times in which you may have to come up to code if your addition triggers certain obligations. If you change the type of occupancy, if you change use, if the addition that you put on the building affects the building's functioning, you can at that point trigger potentially either a portion of the building or the entire building that exists and need to update and or come into compliance with other portions of the code depending on what how the addition impacts the building. Chapter 25 of the International Building Code and the language that's in there makes it fairly clear that that's not a standard obligation, but there's a case-by-case basis where I think anytime you have an addition to a building, the code enforcement officer would be going out to inspect and to see whether or not the type of addition, where the addition is going, if it's blocking egress and ingress, those sorts of things, changing issues with the number of exits you have on the building, that very well may trigger at a minimum that you have to make some changes to your existing structure to come back into compliance. And then in some cases, if you're changing the type of use or the occupancy, you then conceivably have to change the entire, keep the entire building up to code in the current code opposed to the old code. I think the example I gave was if you changed occupancy type, well, that will trigger the entire building then would have to be up to the current code for occupancy. If you change the type of use of the building, and so you go in from a storage facility to a manufacturing facility, you can't get out from underneath that by making an addition and then hoping that addition doesn't trigger the rest of the building to not fall into that new classification. But if you're adding, not changing the occupancy, not changing the use type, and you aren't changing the structural soundness of the building, at that point you're not going to need to make updates to the old existing building to make it in keeping with the current code. But again, there's only 700 some pages of code to read through. There are a lot of things that can get triggered when you're doing additions, or if you're doing modifications. Even if you're not doing an addition, if you're doing an amendment on the building. So it's going to really come down to individual projects, compliance from the building officer to make sure that what the code has for requirements is still being met and that the structure and type of building isn't being changed so significantly that it no longer is in keeping with what it was originally built for. So like I said, I think the simple answer is no, it does not trigger, in addition does not trigger you having to bring the whole building up to code, the current code, but it certainly can in some instances, and so it's something to be wary of when we're walking through this process in terms of variances, walking this process for our code enforcement officers and our building inspectors, or for fire department when they're going out there and checking to see if an addition is going to dramatically change fire safety and the issues that you might see based upon exits, entrances, and signage, things like that. So again, it does not trigger it, but it can in certain instances. So I think the general rule is no. There are a lot of specific times when it very well might cause you to have to either come up to code partially or change the entire, if the building's being changed for its use or occupancy, have the entire building then come up to code that is current opposed to what it would have been when it was built.
Anybody from the public like to speak to this agenda item? None? Council discussion?
Under the construction that's going to happen, under the foot that he's laying out to rebuild, to add on to this building, according to what you're saying, he is still required to follow the code. Is that correct?
So I want to be clear, so we've talked about a couple different places. You're
I'm
saying
talking about one
key-
spot, the adding of the building.
Are we talking about,
The new section of the building, is it required to be under the existing code?
any addition, anything that's being built currently falls under current code, and fall under the code generally, and then chapter 25, which is additions to existing buildings. So anything you're building now would be underneath the code as is currently adopted by the city. What you can't do, for example, is you can't have an old building that was grandfathered in and then start making additions to it that don't comply with current code. You can't use it as a workaround for current code. So the best way to think about it would be like if you bought a 2,000 square foot shop and you wanted to add a 20,000 square foot shop on it, that 20,000 square foot shop would be underneath the current code, not the code that was the original building's code. So when the original building was built, there's compliance there, it's fine, but you don't get to grandfather in the original code when you make additions on the building. You're using the code as is today.
Okay, as I understand it, and I've been in the existing building, I've been in there.
Mhm.
As I understand it, under the original issue of a permit to build, that it was listed for other than what it's being used for. Has that changed things on it?
Well,
Let's say, for example, it was built for storage and it's now being used for mechanical purposes.
okay. So if the type, we're talking about what the use of the building is,
It's existing building.
okay, the existing building, I'd have to, for any building, I think the code enforcement officer would have to look at the original drawings, and those would have on there, whatever the stamped architectural and engineering paperwork would have on there what the building type was, correct? So you look back at that, and then compare that to what's being used for now, currently, because if there's a change in occupancy, that'd have to be something that'd be taken up with the code enforcement officer. So again, I'll speak generally to that issue, because I don't know, I don't know. I haven't seen anything about any specific buildings. That being said, if the use of the building, again, I'll use a kind of a silly example, but if you build a church and turn it and start manufacturing auto parts in that church, well, that's not an assembly anymore. Now we're talking about probably an F1 designation, and so that would be something for code enforcement to be looking at based upon what the original use of the building was versus what it's actually being used for in practice.
Scott, do you remember what the original motion was pertaining to when you brought it up and I made the motion and you seconded it about checking to see if there was an alternative method for fire extinguisher, or extinguishing fires? Isn't that what the original motion was? Do any of you remember?
I think Dakota received a couple different guidance from council.
Well, the guidance,
One was
the
what you
one
just-
that he just gave is the one I asked him
That was your
about.
particular question, yeah.
After that motion was
Yeah,
made.
yeah.
Is that correct?
So I'm just going back to look at the minutes right now, because that'd be the first place I'd look to see what was discussed in terms of sprinkler systems and anything like that. And it looks like there was I know what your question was, and I remember specifically because that's what we answered, I think. That says alternatives for sprinkler systems.
Yes.
I don't remember, Scott, I don't remember a motion regarding that.
No, the only motion is what,
You said in one motion.
Now, there may have been
It
discussion
was
about
discussed.
Yeah, we discussed it. I
Um,
think the discussion was, are they required in the use that's in the building permit?
Well, you made the decision. You discussed it. You said, could we ask Dakota to check in to see if there was an alternative other than the sprinkler system for fire recession, to put out fires?
I think that was in the context of Rice Precision, because
Oh,
they have the
yeah.
unique scenario where they have the millions of dollars worth of electronic equipment. And we were asking if there were any alternate
Is that where
fires.
that was at?
Yeah, because that wouldn't be a city mandate, and that's what he was talking about, maybe, you know, Halon or things that they do where there's a lot of expensive electrical equipment. That's more of a business decision and or an insurance company decision. I don't think it's in the code that we would require alternate.
No, it's not in the code that we require all of them. It requires one. The code does.
Well, if I think part of the discussion, and this is what did come up regarding sprinkler systems and alternative methodologies, that one of the issues I think is that there is, and this was what was brought up by some of the public speakers, was that in the code there is a provision for modifications. And that section was referred to repeatedly in terms of modifications. Now, that section then expressly states that you can, so long as you're not increasing the risk to life and health, and there are alternative solutions or alternative provisions you can put in place to protect both the structural integrity and the life and health of anyone in that building, you can approve modifications as the code enforcement officer or the building officer. So there are alternative methods that, not specific ones, but alternative methods could be approved working in conjunction with the building officer. But those would have to be ones that building officer determines does not increase the risk to health and safety in that building. And I think I can,
Would those be subject to fire marshal approval as well?
it's not a change in code, it's a modification. So
It's
that
a
would,
local modification. It doesn't have to go.
it doesn't, it needs to be written up,
Ordinance would.
or an ordinance would. Similarly, there's we talked about this in 2 weeks ago as well. You could do an individual could request from the fire marshal approval for alternative variance or alternative program that would then supersede anything that a city and municipality's building officer would approve or disapprove of. So if the state fire marshal receives a written request for a variance and approves that, wouldn't matter what we did. That would supersede anything that we decided. And it's the same goes for Board of Zoning or the Zoning Board of Appeals. If there were requests made to it and it approved modifications or variances, then that under KAR 22-1-1, that becomes part of our, it doesn't become part of our code, but it's adopted into the city and it's allowable that way as well. But that's a wholly separate process that doesn't involve the council, at least not up front.
So if the council were to change the code, it's still got to go to the fire marshal's office, is that correct?
It depends on what provision of the code you're changing. And I've had a conversation with the state fire marshal's office about this, and in full candor, without providing the state fire marshal with explicit language, they couldn't say whether or not they would have to approve it or disapprove of it. But if we were to change certain parts of the code, we would never have to get the state fire marshal approval for that. What the state fire marshal, with their council and compliance folks said to me was that if the change in code impacts fire prevention, they have to have the ability to approve or disapprove of it. What I can't say for certain is when that's triggered, because there are sections in the building code, in the International Building Code, that are fire prevention specific, chapters 7 through 11. But there's also provisions throughout the code that are related to fire prevention, they're just not in those sections. And then there are provisions throughout the code that aren't related to fire prevention directly, but you can certainly see how they would have an impact on fire safety if you were to get rid of them. And what I can't get an answer out of the state fire marshal office about, without providing them specific language, is whether or not they would need to approve or disapprove of a change in the code. I will say this. This is not about the state fire marshal specifically, that this is the sense I got from the conversation. Regulatory agencies tend to view their ability to regulate much broader than entities that are being regulated. And so while we may disagree with them about when we need their approval for a change in code, the concern that I have about this generally is most times, I think a lot of times people behave as act first, ask for forgiveness later. The problem here, especially when we're dealing with fire prevention, is acting first and asking for forgiveness later doesn't happen until you have an event that normally requests forgiveness, and if that event is a structure fire, that's far different than an event which might be, would not impair potentially life and limb. So, for the state fire marshal's position, if any change in code weakens what they believe to be weakens fire prevention, they're going to have take a very hard look at that. And so it gets, and I'm going to go back to this where it gets tricky, is if we modify portions of code that are not fire prevention portions but tangentially relate back to it, do we need their approval before we change those? I can't give you a certain answer about that today. The best practice, I think, would be to take those changes to them and ask them before making those changes. At the same time, I think the alternative is you're not going to get the Attorney General's office probably to issue an opinion about this. You're not going to get into court to have a judge give you an answer about this. And so the state fire marshal is going to take a very conservative view of it. And so most portions of the code that are going to be changed that are in any way, shape, or form could be related to fire prevention, they're probably going to assert their authority that they have the ability to reject or approve those within 30 days. So that's where we sit now based upon my conversations with them, and why it makes it hard for me to say when a change in code would or would not trigger the state fire marshal's involvement. If it's in chapter 7 through 11, I think that's pretty obvious. It's got to be through them because those are the fire prevention sections of the code. Outside of that, it becomes a little more gray. The other issue I just would be remiss if I didn't bring up would be that part of the reason why you want to be cautious on this is because of liability. And if we were to pass code changes that led to an event down the road, we couldn't fall back on the code to say, well, we enforce the code as like the minimum standards as is adopted by the state of Kansas, and therefore our liability we might have more exposure based upon our changes to code if we are underneath the minimum standards that the state of Kansas has set for code for fire prevention.
You're saying we could be sued, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that it increases our risk of that. I mean, we can always be sued. That anyone can file a suit whenever they want to. But I think it would be much more likely that we would be brought into a suit and much more likely that we would be held liable if we had made changes to the fire prevention code that the state fire marshal never saw and never approved. Conversely, if you send it to the state fire marshal and they review it and approve it, well, then we've got the state fire marshal okaying what we've done. That gives us some coverage. It means that the head of fire prevention of the state of Kansas has reviewed what we want to do and has taken into consideration and approved it, which would normally mean that they do not believe that increased the risk to health or safety of people in that building or nearby buildings. So that's where the state fire marshal's authority helps municipalities, is that they can put their stamp of approval on it. And they can do that for individual projects as well, which would frankly, doing that on an individual project basis keeps us out of the conversation entirely and then it's between the state fire marshal and the individual builder, but the city wouldn't have made any changes, would not have been party to it, so we really wouldn't have any liability in that circumstance. But yeah, I mean, the main concerns you end up having here for changing code is going to be whether or not it exposes to more liability, whether or not it undermines the safety of the buildings that are being built and triggers insurance issues and or potentially safety issues down the road.
You did good.
Alright, I think that automatically moved us into the next agenda item.
I'm sorry?
I said, that moves us right into the next agenda item, because the last one didn't need an action. So, proposed sprinkler system ordinance amendment, which is in your packet.
Sorry.
Hang on a second.
Can I add something, sir?
Yep, you can step up to the.
Okay. Oh, stretch my legs. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the council. I wanted to put in a couple of things. Thank you, Dakota. I couldn't hear exactly everything you said, but I would like to say that the Kansas Fire Prevention Code reads, when a municipality adopts one of the nationally recognized fire codes, which we have, the 2003 International Fire Code has been adopted, or the fire protection segment of a nationally recognized building code, which we have in the 2003 International Building Code, and modifies a section of that code. A summary of the modification shall be submitted to the State Fire Marshal's office and on with a 30-day review and so forth. For clarification purposes, under existing buildings and structures, which Dakota had talked about a little bit, additions or alterations shall not be made to an existing building or structure which will cause the existing building or structure to be in violation of any provision of this code. This is the existing building code that we've adopted also. The requirements of this chapter shall not provide the basis for removal or abrogation of a fire protection and safety systems devices in an existing structure. The code commentary, which is basically the building code, but the engineers that write the code commentate on what it actually means.
Stu, real quick, could you just introduce yourself, just for the public?
Stu Young, sorry, building official for Baldwin. Sorry about that, folks.
Good.
I'm just trying to shed a little light to give something for everybody to think about. The code compliance book is a regular code book. It adds commentary about what sections mean, because oftentimes myself, and I'm sure you guys can read a code and you have to read it several times occasionally to get the true meaning of it. It says compliance with other codes. This is existing building. Alterations, repairs, additions, and changes of occupancy to existing structures shall comply with the provisions for alterations, repairs, additions, and changes of occupancy in the International Fire Code. And it goes on to list the fuel, gas, the mechanical, the electrical, and other. So I'm just saying there's a lot to be said about it. All these different fire codes, but I think at the end of the day, Dakota is seeing it right. I think that we've got our 2003 building code, which you guys have ability, it looks like, to make changes on. At the end of the day, all this has to come back through the fire marshal's office. There's just so much literature in these books relating to all these different fire code sections. It goes on to say, one more thing. I know that one of the owners brought up the modifications section, and I won't read the whole thing, but it says providing the building official shall first find that the special individual reason makes the strict letter of this code impractical, and the modification is in compliance with the intent and purpose of this code, and that such modification does not lessen health, accessibility, life, and fire safety or structural requirements. So that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you.
Anybody else from the public like to speak to this agenda item? Seeing none, council discussion?
Well, I feel that we need to be really careful if we're gonna make these modifications. Just because of the liability that Dakota talked about. Because isn't it true that if somebody sues the city, they can also sue the council members?
So it depends answer.
Okay.
So there are times when you'll have individual liability or potentially exposure. There's also times where you as council members would have either qualified or complete immunity depending on the situation. Something like this, off the top of my head, I could not tell you if changing fire codes or changing, actually, I'll be careful about this. If changing in the International Building Code, portions of that were outside of the fire prevention code, a portion of the IBC, if that would trigger any sort of personal liability for the council members, I don't, without going into all the factual background there, I can't say for certain one way or the other, and I could certainly take a look at that for you. And this is one of the issues, though, too, where I think council having a full and clear understanding of what they are getting themselves into, making any changes, might be beneficial. But again, I go back to the lawyerly answer of it depends. It would, if there had, fraud, if there had been, ethical violations or criminal violations that occurred. So I think I'm not saying this because anyone's done this whatsoever, but if it was learned that council members had taken payments, bribes, things like that, that could then expose you to liability that you wouldn't, just based upon the decision you made that you thought was in the best interest of the community and acting in your capacity as a council member. So that's why I'd say it would all depend, but if you'd like a fuller answer about that, I can certainly dig into it and provide that to you before you make a decision as well.
I can see where we would be liable, it appears like that we would be liable to an insurance company, a lawsuit quicker than probably anything else. If there were a fire and they tried to collect insurance money and the insurance, and they say, well, the city allowed this to happen. And the insurance company says, okay, it's the city's responsibility then. Would that be a situation that could happen?
What I would see being the more likely scenario is an insurance company looking at the individual buildings plans and the reclassification that would be made based upon ordinance change and saying if that, based upon what the ordinances are in the city and based on what your specific plans are for this building, we don't feel comfortable insuring your building at a normal, at what they would have insured them at if they had if they followed the minimum standards set in the Kansas Fire Prevention Code. I don't see where, well, I want to be clear, your question is whether or not an insurance company would be bringing us into court.
Right.
It'd be more likely that an insurance company would be denied the claim based upon the insured's failure to follow the minimum safety procedures that they would be required to follow the insurance contract, which would involve the city.
But it would wind up being one step down because the proprietor or owner of that company would be suing the insurance company, and then it's going to come the other direction.
Insurance companies have no interest in suing anybody if they don't pay out on a claim.
They
So basically, yeah, they would deny the claim based on a misrepresentation. You would put on your insurance forms that, yeah, we have all fire.
So they would be sued by the proprietor?
Insurance companies don't sue anybody if they don't pay.
No.
Yeah.
If the insurance company denied it and the master wants his money, then we get sued then?
So we can always get sued by any individual. That being said, I think the concern you'd have in the city is if we made assurances to someone that since we've changed code, that you're now in compliance, and then their insurance provider says, well, this is a material change, we're not gonna insure your building anymore, or we didn't know about this, so because of that, we're gonna deny your claim, and then they come back, and so the individual building, so the owner or the LLC, whoever the entity is, would be the entity that probably would end up suing us, not the insurance company. That would be after the insurance company denied a claim. And then because then you're left holding them, as an individual, left holding the bag, and we're looking for someone else to pay that claim, if the insurance company's not going to, and the city would be the only one with involvement in deep enough pockets to pay that claim.
Well, for the purposes of this discussion, what the council is about to make a vote on
Mhm.
is whether or not to have the state fire marshal review potential changes, right? So any exposure on the city would then, it may not be completely shifted, but that takes a big chunk out of it.
So if the council wants to, the council believes that the change to code, the state fire marshal, that will give us a great amount of coverage and protection because the state fire marshal can approve or disapprove of that change. What I'd say is that if you do that, then for the 30-day provision, the state fire marshal will let us know within 30 days whether or not they approve or disapprove of it. And by passing, if you do vote and the council decide to pass the change to the code, it won't go in effect until the state fire marshal approved or disapproved of it. So we would basically be in a holding pattern until that occurred. So we wouldn't expose ourselves to any liability because in that 30-day period, nothing would happen. If the state fire marshal approved of it, then we're in a much stronger position from a liability perspective than we would be if we never sent it to them. Frankly, if they disapproved of it, I think at that point, we would be, there's nothing in this is where there's no case law, there's nothing in the statute or KAR and the regulations that says you can't then make those changes still. It's silent to that. We have to have approval from them. But if you're the state fire marshal saying you can't do this, I think one, if you went ahead with it, you are inviting lawsuits and inviting litigation. And two, there's a real chance the state fire marshal will then bring suit and haul us into court to say you can't make the change anyway because we told you can't modify it. You're modifying it anyway, and we have the authority to bring you to court on this. So that's a fight I'd rather not.
I can only speak for myself, but I have no interest in making an appeal to the state fire marshal and then going against those
Right.
recommendations.
Did I pick up on what you said earlier, though, that the only time the state would go to the state marshal on modification would be through chapter 7 through 11?
So
And you're proposing a chapter 4 change, if I read this?
chapter 3, I believe. So chapter 7 through 11 are the fire prevention sections of the code. That does not mean that there's not fire prevention littered throughout the rest of the code.
Right.
And when I spoke with the state fire marshal, and well, not the state fire marshal, when I spoke with their compliance personnel, their position is that anything that impacts fire safety or would drop our adopted code below the minimum standards for Kansas Fire Prevention Act, that has to come before them. And so in this instance, if you're changing the classification for a building that went from a building that needs to have a sprinkler system to a building that does not need to have a sprinkler system, the state fire marshal's position is that impacts fire prevention, and therefore we have the ability to approve or disapprove of it, even if it's not part of what is considered by code the fire prevention section. And like, as I said, I have zero case law, zero regulations, zero statutes to back up that claim.
I was gonna say, so that's their interpretation.
That is
Because
100% their
what
interpretation.
That rule states.
It
That
isn't,
rule states that if you change the fire prevention code, it has to be approved.
so, and I think goes back to the memo from last time, but correct, if it's, and again, it's KAR 22-1-1. I'm gonna pull it up in front of me so I can read exactly what the language of it is. But based upon that, it's the municipal compliance with the Kansas Fire Prevention Code. And so, as Stu had said, it's, what we've adopted is the nationally recognized building code which has a fire protection segment. Once we've adopted that, that requires us then to send a summary of all modifications to the state fire marshal's office. And what's unclear about this KAR is that modifications to the building code, that the fire protection segment, what's the fire protection segment? Is it anything that deals with fire protection? Is it the chapter 7 through 11? The state fire marshal is almost assuredly, as I said, going to read this as broadly as possible to give them as much authority as possible, given what their task and charge is from the governor's office, which is to enforce the fire safety prevention. But it's not clear in this KAR if, and then this goes back to, I think, Jerry's original question, if we make a change to code, we don't have to send every change of code to the state fire marshal. But their position is if it impacts fire safety, it has to go through that. And you can look through case law, you can look through the KAR, when they adopted the KARs, you can look through when they adopted statutes and legislative language there. There's just no clear guidance for us. I think the clearest guidance I can give you on this is that the state fire marshal has a very specific task and job to do. And when you start dealing with code that impacts fire safety in some way, shape, or form, a broader, more conservative reading is going to protect the city more than a narrow reading. But that's my answer normally for all matters, not just this. It's if you want to be safe, be as conservative and broad as possible and do things ahead of time, even if you don't have to. Because you could send something to the state fire marshal and they go, why did you send this to us? Of course you're fine doing this. It has nothing to do with us. But that's up to them to decide a lot of times. And then we would have crossed our T's and dotted our I's and wouldn't be exposed to liability for that.
I don't recall when we passed the ordinance for the trailer houses to change the setback rules that we went through the state fire marshal's service.
I don't think we did. And I think so setback could have a impact on fire safety, correct?
I mean, you can articulate basically any change to any code at any time, depending on the circumstance, has an impact on fire safety.
So are we in violation already or something else?
No, I mean, no. What I'm saying is you could read that in the most conservative manner possible and everything has to, so now we're governed by the state fire marshal on anything we do? That's not even realistic.
I don't
Wouldn't
think that
the
even,
fire marshal agree that the setback needed to be done, so that the fire trucks and stuff could get
I
in
don't
there?
think so.
They could, yeah.
But
Well,
do they?
I mean, why would they say, no, you can't do that?
I'm not saying that they would,
No.
but I'm saying change the side yard setback to a house or to bring in more condensed housing to fit more housing in an area. Is change, I mean, that's my point, is any type of change like that.
I think that would that fall more under our city fire marshal than it would the state force.
That's what I'm arguing, is if, you know, logic tells you that
Well, what's our city fire marshal say?
city fire chief,
No, our fire marshal, he is also a fire marshal of the city of Baltimore.
what does he say about what?
What you're saying? When you made the setback, what he say about it?
He was fine with it, you know.
So it's a done deal.
So getting back on track, I mean, I think we asked for a recommendation on an amendment, potential amendment around the modifications that we discussed last time. That would be as least disruptive and minimize any potential safety concerns. And I think that's what you provided here in this amendment proposal. It basically changing the classification
So,
of agricultural to F2 instead of F1. Is that?
and this is, again, without seeing any plans, without knowing,
Yeah.
I mean, and to be clear, this is a general ordinance change. So therefore it applies to any and all businesses that would
Right.
fall underneath it. What I, based upon the comments of the council, comments of the public, tried to do was create as narrow a modification as possible. The alternatives to this would be, and alternatives to this would be going into, say, I think the section we discussed last time, section 903, for the fire of the international building codes. Talking about square footage, and that struck me as being far more, it would open up a lot of doors for a lot of different entities. Also, I think, I'm not sure what the number is that the council would feel comfortable with. I'm not sure what the number anyone would feel comfortable with. And potentially for the state fire marshal's office, I don't think that there's a number that they would feel comfortable with other than the number that's in the code right now. This seemed to be the cleanest way to do it with the least intrusion into the code. That being said, and this is what I think we talked about this a little bit last time, if you're going to be making modifications to the code in any way, shape, or form, if the fire marshal's office sees as lessening protections, it's going to be a tough sell to them as to why that should be happening. Opposed to variances, individual variances that might be fact specific and case specific, but that's not we can't do anything about that. We have limited abilities, or you as a council have limited ability to do these things without an individual proposal before you. So if our goal is to change code in a way that impacts the fewest, or leaves us open to the fewest modifications going down the road, and limits the scope of it to potentially get approval by the state fire marshal, I think this was the simplest and cleanest resolution. That's not saying it's the right one, or that there aren't other solutions to this. There's 7, again, there's a lot of code in here, but this is the one I thought, based upon my understanding of the situation, was the cleanest and simplest.
You all see what he's proposing, the amendment? Basically, if I'm summarizing it correctly, it's, there's factory industrial, hazard occupancy, identification and uses. And, under F1, there is, moderate hazard F1, there's a list of 50 or 60 of those uses, and agricultural machinery is one of them. And if you look on down below, under factory industrial F2 low hazard occupancy, there's 10 of them. And basically what I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is potential here is to move agricultural machinery out of F1 moderate hazard down into F2 low hazard.
Correct. And I want to highlight something for the council here too, which is that this is the F1 and F2 designations. Those are, if you look at the summary language for those sections, for the F classifications, so section 306, that's factory industrial group. 306.1 explicitly discusses the factory industrial group F occupancy includes, among other things, use of a building or structure for assembling, disassembling, fabricating, finishing, manufacturing, packaging, repairing, or processing operations that are not classified as Group H hazardous or Group S storage occupancy. So there is a possibility as well that you could make these modifications, and depending on who was applying, how a building is classified, they might also fall underneath Group H or Group S, and this would not impact those entities at all because it's only applied to Group F1. So I say that as a way to say that agricultural machinery is only listed underneath F1. It's not listed in any other sections. And if the council is concerned based upon the industries in our community, the location of our community, its ties to the rural community, specifically with agricultural machinery, because that's something we deal with very often. This is the only section of that code that deals with, says the word agricultural machinery. But individual applicants would have to be coming underneath that F1 designation, or priorly under the F1 designation, and now the F2 designation for this to apply to them if we were to change the code in this way. Should they be underneath the hazardous, so underneath group H, or they were housed underneath the storage section, which would be group S, this would not in any way, shape, or form impact them, and they would still then be subject to the same requirements that are currently placed by code for fire prevention. And so I just want to make sure that the council is aware of that, because again, this is me trying to anticipate what the council wants to do, forward-looking for all businesses to encourage growth here, or encourage companies to choose Baldwin City to develop. But it all depends upon how those companies or how those entities classify themselves and what their engineers and architectural plans, their stamp plans say. So that's just something to keep in consideration, because we would want to make sure that that's where that's the best way to address, as opposed to other sections of the code or other groups for the code. So I just want to highlight that, because it may be that we do this and it doesn't impact anybody, because they don't fall underneath that F1 categorization. But again, that is the only place in the code that I can find, especially in the group section here that we're talking about in chapter 3, that references specifically agricultural machinery.
What code did you use?
So both 2006 and 2003.
Used them both? 2003 is the one, that's the only one we adopted, isn't it?
So 2003 is the one we've adopted. 2006 is what the state references for fire prevention. The code that they have for international building codes. That's what then they will refer to. So that's, now also, I can tell you this: the language is identical.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
It's not. There's no difference between the two.
I've read them both.
That being said, I've looked at both just partly to make sure there wasn't a change in language, so that wouldn't be an issue for us.
I've read both.
So would your recommendation be to pass this amendment by the fire marshal once?
Would my recommendation be that you send this to the fire marshal?
Yes.
Yes.
And
I wouldn't
expect anything else from you.
Yes.
So, and then follow-up question is, if they reject this particular amendment, does that then prohibit the proprietors from doing their own modification request?
Absolutely not. Any proprietor, so again, I'm wanting to be clear about this because this is a general provision. So if we were to make 30 requests to the fire marshal and got rejected every single time, and after that, different entities, companies, individual homeowners, whoever, went in and made requests for variances, they can make a request for variance and be approved regardless of what happened to us. The difference being that the state fire marshal with us would only be looking at a change in code. There's no facts they're looking at for a specific situation.
Right.
So there's no issues with whether or not a site has the ability to comply, whether or not it's impractical, whether or not they have special machinery, equipment, product, those sorts of things. We can't take it up in the code. We can take it. That's taken up in the code. But it becomes far trickier for us to go in and start changing each and every single lever, where the state fire marshal and individual entities that want to make variance requests can do that on a site-by-site basis. And so that's the difference between a general and specific request, which is we're making a general request. Individual applicants would be making individual requests, just applies to them. And I also say I did get from the state fire marshal the application, how to go about getting that application, how to go about also requesting all of their previous variances. So I've got a request into them for individual variances, because that also, I think, may help the council know what it is that they would and would not approve. For individual modifications, I think that would inform any changes to code about when it'd be more likely they would allow us to change code. It's not apples to apples, but it's closer.
So if this passes the fire marshal,
Mhm.
is it then, in your opinion, that the variances that the two businesses were seeking would no longer apply? They need to get variances?
Again, I'm not sure. I haven't seen a variance application from anyone. So I've had public comment that I've heard
Yep.
from multiple folks about potential issues with code. But as far as I'm aware, there's never been a variance request. I've not seen any plans for anything. And that's why I want to be clear. This is a very general question opposed to an individual question. I did hear individuals from the community express frustration with the code and requesting that we examine modifications, but that is a building officer issue, not a council issue if they're talking about modifications. Or it's a zoning board of appeals issue, which requires an actual proposal with plans that someone could review. That's not the council's task. So I really, it's really, not that I can't answer the question, but
Let me
I
ask it a
think
different way.
yeah.
My understanding was just the requirement to have fire suppression in the new buildings.
Mhm.
And so if this amendment passed the fire marshal based on the 2003, 2006 code in their F2, would that then not require fire suppression in those buildings? So.
I don't know, because I don't
So-
know what that group, I'm not sure
Okay.
what those buildings
So
classifications
here's
would
my
be.
question. That's in my head.
Well,
Just question the fact that if we go through this, it may not even impact what we're trying to do.
And that's
We're
the-
thinking about doing, I won't say trying.
So, again, I just go back, that's where, this is a general
Yeah, I
provision,
understand.
and whoever applies for it would have to be underneath that F1 subsection now in agricultural machinery, to
Right.
then be moved to the F2 category.
Right, we just don't know what the difference is, or fire code requirements, maybe.
Hi, this is Stu again, City Building Inspector. I want to just try to help bring some clarification so you guys can help with your decision process. It's very in-depth. I mean, we've adopted the 2003, we have the Fire Prevention Code and the International Fire Code. Altogether, there's about 17 different classifications of buildings with dozens of different requirements. But what I want to talk about is the ordinance at hand. And here's what I want to clarify. The fact that we're considering moving agricultural machinery to F2, that's what I want to talk about. The agricultural machinery contains oil, fuel, and gasoline. Therefore, whether it's a tractor, mower, for informational purposes, it's combustible. So here's the definition of F2. F2, factory, low industrial hazard occupancy, factory industrial uses that involve the fabrication or manufacturing of non-combustible materials, which during finishing, packaging, or processing do not involve a significant fire hazard, shall be classified as F2. This is just for information. What I want to say is structures classified in group F2, low hazard, are occupied for the purpose of fabrication, manufacturing, or processing of non-combustible materials. It is acceptable for non-combustible products to be packaged in a combustible material, provided that the fuel content contributed by the packaging is negligible. But my point is that F2 group is designed for manufacturing of non-combustible materials. So I would imply that the council take the needed time to look into this and see how the combustible fuel holding machinery, I'm not against any of this, I'm just saying as far as decision-making purposes, how it actually fits into that group. That's my only concern with that. Any questions? Thank you.
Is an auto mechanic F2?
Auto mechanic would probably fall underneath S1, which is the motor vehicle repair garages. That's a moderate hazard storage. And even though it says storage in the language of, and that's just, if you want to look at the code, it's 311.2. So buildings occupied for storage uses that are not classified as group S2, which is low risk, that include but are not limited to storage of the following. In the last line, the last one on the first line is motor vehicle repair garages complying with the maximum allowable quantities of hazardous materials listed in table 307.1, parenthetical 1. So that is, so repair garages, like car garage, like those would fall underneath S1. Similarly, there's aircraft repair hangars are underneath S1.
So would an auto repair structure would it have to be sprinkled?
S1, and Stu can correct me if I'm wrong, but S1 has to be sprinkled if they reach, and again, there's a certain, square footage that needs to be met there, but yes.
12,000.
So it's a 12,000 square foot requirement of fire space. And so that's where that would fall under S1 if you're a mechanic shop, like a car repair shop. Now, most car repair shops are far, far, far smaller than 12,000 square feet.
Right.
Um,
Which to me increases the risk. The smaller in a confined space you are
Right.
with combustibles, the more risk you are.
Well, and if you'd like to modify the code to include
I'm just saying. I'm just saying you can go and poke holes everywhere.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if you look at the S1, like the things that are included in S1 storage, aerosols, so you can see where that might be an issue. So canvas and leather,
Yeah, but they have books and paper and rolls attached.
which are combustible. I mean, compared to say metal parts or metals, where you're not concerned about metal fabrication causing fires. Comparatively. Ironically, in S2 you have stoves, so there's not hooked up to anything yet.
So for the two businesses that spoke last council meeting,
Mhm.
it seems like the metal products fabrication and assembly F2 would apply to one of them.
I don't know what their classification is. I'm not exactly sure what that. I'll be honest, as someone who's not familiar with that business, I don't know exactly what they do. But my understanding is if it is metal fabrication, that to me would be either F2 or S2, depending on if it's storage or if it's doing machine work.
Building shop.
But that'd be a question I think that it's an individual question based upon plans that you need to submit, and the proper course of action in my head would be to go through the normal channels on that, bring in your building officer, and at that point go forward. What we're discussing, I think, is I'll put it this way: if there was a company that does metal manufacturing or metal creates metal parts and fabrication, I don't think this change to code will impact that company at all. Because I don't think that unless their metal parts they're manufacturing are agricultural equipment, which they might be, I don't think it would impact them at all.
When we say sprinkler system, you know, according to the head on the sprinkler, if this room's 45 feet long, there'd be a sprinkler there. If the fire started here, this sprinkler would be the only one that works. The rest of them don't turn on until they get hot. They all have the thing, and them are set to a certain degree. So when they talk about sprinkler system ruining everything or doing this and that, it's not going to do that unless it gets hot enough to get them all off.
No, that's
All at one
Baker.
time.
At Baker University, how much a sprinkler system runs things?
I don't know about Baker.
I guess I just don't see that this change based on the classification of fuel storage, those types of things would pass, when we try. The fire marshal, I guess, is it's gonna be a waste of 30 days.
I think so this is not about this change specifically, but anytime you go to the fire marshal with a modification to code that's going to lessen the requirements,
Yeah.
it's going to be a difficult sell unless there's something there that you're also putting in place to buffer it or to make, that doesn't mean it's impossible,
Right.
but I just, from a practical standpoint, it's going to be, the less weakening the code is going to be a hard sell for them.
Would it come into another thing, Scott, when if we went to the fire marshal, we'd be recognized quicker and get looked at for different things.
What you're
It's
saying.
kind of like getting 3 speeding tickets and the cops watching you for the next one. Once you notify them about something that you want to do, then they start looking at what else you got.
No history of the fire marshal, so I couldn't say either way.
But I can't imagine if you're asking them permission for something, if that's gonna red flag for anything.
I mean, if we're talking a practical stance, I mean, talking about practical stance. You're storing tractors that are already in there. And they're adding on square foot so that they can bring in combines. So practical stance, somebody please explain to me, practically, where the rest comes in that we don't currently have right now.
That's the irony for me, like I pointed out, like the tighter confined space has more exposure than the big wide open one. So to me, the more square footage you add, the less,
Right,
less
and the
exposure you
less
have. Yeah.
risk.
Why didn't he have fire sprinklers the first go around?
I don't know, I wasn't here in the first go around.
It was pre-2003.
It was before 2003, he built it in
That's the
98.
difference.
It was what?
He built it in 98.
Yeah, but then he did an addition.
They didn't have fire codes at that time?
No, they didn't use the 2003, yeah, they didn't have to have them.
Would have been whatever code they had at that time.
The footage is the same.
Footage is already past, already over footage now.
It's 12,000 feet, you know. The addition exceeds that.
The current one is just
What is the addition?
8,000.
The addition's only 8,000? Well, weird.
It adds on to the current building.
But we just said you don't have to go back and make adjustments to the full building.
Right,
If the new building's 8,000 square feet, and that's the only part that's being brought in, then they're under 12,000.
So there's a combined area of all groups too. So if you go to the combined area that's more than 24,000 square feet, then it triggers. So that would be, for anything you're building, it'd be above that because it's already over 24,000 square feet as is right now. That would then, anything you're building onto it under current code would require to be, if it's F1, would require a fire suppressant system in there. What you are talking about and what is true is if any entity was to build a freestanding structure that was less than 12,000 square feet and they were F1 or S1 designation, as long as they're compliant with the code in terms of setbacks, in terms of distance from other buildings, a new freestanding building would not be an addition to an existing structure, would not impact the total square footage. It would be a separate building that would then be looked at as its own structure. If that was less than 12,000 square feet, that would not trigger the requirement to put in a sprinkler system in that freestanding building. Again, this would require our building official to review plans, to get a scope of work that would then be able to tell what that would look like. But from a preliminary matter, we can't make any determination for an individual basis until we have a proposal and plan before us.
But hypothetically, if that proposal was, we have a 12,000 square foot building, we want to add on another 8,000 square feet, that makes 20,000 then where you're putting over the 12 requirements, so the new portion would have to be sprinkled, but the old portion wouldn't have to be, but the old portion still counts for this square footage that makes you excess?
The combined area of all group S1 fire areas or all F1 fire areas.
That's absurd.
So,
Well, that's where
That's
it goes back.
completely absurd.
Please
So-
explain the practical side, that you can separate the building by 1 foot and it's considered a separate building, and therefore you don't have to sprinkler 8,000 square feet.
and I would suggest that you probably wouldn't have to separate by a foot because that would probably not be the code.
6 foot.
But,
Firewall.
and again, this is where we get to the difficulty on this is that on the individual basis, there are some absurdities that come into play here. The council can't make decisions about ordinances on those bases though, because you don't have specific instances in front of you. All you have is general
Right.
practice. I'd also say that it's in what we're dealing with right now, for code purposes, having this discussion with as many folks up front and getting it done earlier rather than later. I mean, my biggest concern would be that individuals just move forward, spend large amounts of money building things that we then can't give them a certificate of occupancy for when we, and you know, as a general practice, I'd much rather people be upset with me before they spent millions of dollars than after they spent millions of dollars. So that's why I'm glad the council's having this discussion now about code changes. There also might be some discussions that need to be had between staff and individual folks that can occur without the council's involvement. At least not direct involvement. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think the only action that's been put in front of us today is do we want to approve this amendment and have it go to fire marshal? And that's the only thing I think the decision is today.
And I'd say this, I think you did hit on, there's no real skin off your back if you do that.
Right.
It's not exposed to any increased liability. It gives us some more information as well too. And I would, Jerry, if I'm hearing you right though, the council may also want to consider whether or not sending something up the pipe to the fire marshal triggers them to go, well, hold on, what's going on here? That
There's no way you're going to be able to, you're not going to admit that and say,
no, and Kansas has enough municipalities and counties, enough things going on. The state fire marshal is spread too thin as it is. I'm not concerned about that. That being said, the other thing we can also do is it's a 30-day wait period. There's no requirement that the state fire marshal actually takes all 30 days.
Right.
And if this was something that was approved and sent over to them immediately, you might get an answer back within a week or two as well. So, like I said, I don't think there's no harm done by sending it to them for more information and to see if it's approved. But the only real problem is that you may delay folks' decisions who were relying upon changing code, but that's not the council's concern. The council's concern is whether or not this code would be accepted by the state fire marshal.
is it even the council's, are we compelled to do this and send it to the fire marshal? How come the gentleman who wants it done doesn't contact the fire marshal?
The council is not compelled to make any changes in ordinance whatsoever. It's a question of whether or not you want to do that, but you have under no compunction to do that.
I think the question is, is the council comfortable with the wording changes in this amendment? Whether it solves the current business's issues or not is actually undetermined. So the question is are we comfortable with making this change, knowing our code's gonna be changed going forward? Doesn't mean, our ordinance is anyway, doesn't mean it can't be changed back. So I think that's something we really have on our table.
I mean, do we need to get clarification if it would even make a difference?
And there, while this is in motion, doesn't stop any of the entities from doing their own variance.
Yeah.
And working locally to figure out if there's a path through this. I think we're taking this will be an attempt, but it doesn't limit their options at all. Agree, Casey? Or is that-
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I go back to my stance is obviously we should be looking at our code in the most favorable position to the customer as we possibly can. And if this helps us do that and helps the local business grow, I'm gonna be 100% behind it.
We need to do whatever we can to help support businesses. And, getting this in front of the fire marshal, there's a potential liability on the city. So I'm comfortable with that.
Just wonder if there's any additional information around what Stu put in front of us around storage, those things, I don't know if those are part of what's gonna go on in that building, but if it's not, potentially amending those, a requirement that you can't do this and that, so it might be a flavor of agricultural equipment, more definitive. I don't know, I'm just thinking what the fire marshal might be more inclined to, because you're just basically saying, hey, you deem this as to being the most safe, and then we only do less than that, and I think you go to right there and say, well, why would we do that? But if you can say, well, that's a very broad category, and this entity that happens to fall into that wouldn't be doing these things that probably are more hazardous from a fire. And I don't know if that's true in this case, but that would be something we could actually define this a little tighter with the fire marshal. Okay, two flavors of this, and
I agree with you. I think we need to know what the building is actually going to do. What it's gonna, why are they doing it?
To extend their
yeah.
maintenance shop.
They can't work on combines. Combines are too big.
Well,
That's the thing.
I would think that that would be a problem. If the combines have gas and stuff in them and they're working on them, if they're welding on them or whatever. Sounds like a fire hazard to me.
So then you believe that if a diesel fire started with a tractor, that a sprinkler system is gonna save somebody's life?
Do what?
If a tractor started on fire
Right,
with that diesel in there,
yeah.
that sprinkler system's gonna save somebody's life? Or will more exits save somebody's life?
We're worried about two, same part of the building, so it'll cost us much to rebuild back.
it's not our
It's just not
concern.
our concern.
Or to slow it down a little bit till the fire department gets there. You can't, these are all hypothetical questions, you can't answer that.
We can't answer some of them.
Everything's a hypothetical. Before something's completed.
There's no answer to that.
But there's no answer to the alternative.
Then why ask the question?
Because we can't let code just sit and
Yeah.
and calcify and get.
We have already got guidance, it's state law.
The state law that has on its website a process for appealing it.
it's our job to look at those.
We have
and
looked at it.
We don't have to just be black and white though, Jerry. I think that we need to be more accommodating and more, think more creatively than just, well, this is it and this is how it's gonna be.
I don't know why these two individuals that came and talked to us, why don't they just give their plans and stuff to the fire marshal themselves?
Because they're doing business in our community, I wouldn't think to go to the state to have to ask questions in
Well,
order
if
to
this
build a
is-
building in a small town.
If this is denied, then that's their next alternative.
Potentially. Dakota, did you look at variances? Can they request a variance through our planning commission or
There'd be nothing prohibiting them from going through the standard process of requesting a variance or requesting, make sure I'm using the right language here, not just a variance, but they needed a, oh heck, why is it going around my head? Well, we'll call it a variance. Yeah, there's nothing stopping them from doing that, going through the zoning board of appeals, the zoning board of appeals. There's nothing stopping them from going, any entity from going through the state fire marshal for the same purposes. The state fire marshal would only be for fire safety, for fire prevention purposes, where our zoning board of appeals would be much broader, but fire issues can go through them as well.
correct? So if I read it right, in the state fire marshals, it says that if our zoning board essentially makes a change or allows for a variance, then they deem that as accessible or acceptable.
And so if you, this is that same KAR, same regulation, 22-11, subsection B says, each alternative method of fire protection that has been approved by a local board of appeals as a substitute for strict compliance with code requirements shall be deemed to be in compliance with the Kansas Fire Prevention. So that's an alternative method of fire protection. It wouldn't be, you don't have to do this, it would be an alternative method of fire protection, be it additional, firewall, like if it's a 2-hour firewall that has to be installed, if it's, you have to install a different type of system. I mean, it could be that you have a system that's not, a sprinkler system that's not hooked up to the grid because the pressure there doesn't work, so you have to have a separate, your own personal system that wouldn't be necessarily considered under code, so you have a variance that way. But it would be, anytime that a local board of appeals approves an alternate method of fire protection, then they're saying that's in compliance with the Kansas Fire Prevention Code. They don't review it, so the state fire marshal wouldn't look at that. They just go, if you've taken it up, then we think that that's deemed to be in compliance. It would, though, I think, have to be an alternate method of fire protection, opposed to a variance request that says, I'd like to opt out of this. And so, again, being Kansas and what the case law is on this, there's literally no cases ever involving these KARs or the state fire marshal on these issues. That also then require, that's something that would have to go through our local board of appeals, and they'd have to make a determination.
You can do that in parallel with this activity.
Because then that variance gets, if it's denied, I believe it gets appealed to the council.
So then we're back to the council.
Actually does not.
Yeah.
The zoning board of appeals does not come back to the council. You're thinking of the planning commission.
Right.
They're the same people, but that's a different function. Your only appeal process there is the district court. That does not come back here.
Correct.
Doesn't make no sense.
Yeah.
Can't make a decision, but it would come around then and get.
Right, yeah, so no, you don't get two swipes at this. Sorry. It's probably for the better.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's not listening. Now, I'm okay with moving forward with this amended ordinance. See what happens. I don't know if they'll get any guidance back, you know, once we get, if there were a tighter definition around that, would there be any guidance from them on that? Maybe we can just wait and see.
Yeah.
All right. I will, make a motion.
I move to authorize the city attorney to send the amendment of the fire prevention code to the state fire for review and
Second.
And is this approving the ordinance or just sending it to the fire marshal?
Just on a procedural issue here at the last second, even though you made a motion, sorry.
Sorry,
We've had a
motion's never-
tradition, had a tradition of reading ordinances twice. Are we,
Good point.
we not doing that, or is, I mean, you don't have, I don't believe you have to, but it's
I
been
guess
our
it depends
tradition
on
if
what
you
type of
want.
ordinance, 'cause we've done it both ways on
So-
multiple ordinances.
So that, I mean, it's completely.
Yeah, so this wouldn't go to them, it costs us another 2 weeks.
And we just discussed it last week.
And since there's precedent in not doing 2 readings, and we
Jerry, I'll-
discussed it in depth last time,
Yeah, I feel like last week, was the last time I was the
first
first
kind of
meeting.
the first,
Yeah,
wasn't the first reading of this.
no.
But I think what we discussed was all around this, and this is probably the most minimal change of everything we discussed that we could possibly do.
Right.
So I'll leave my motion out
And then your second.
Yes, I leave my second.
there. Approval, yes.
Approval of the ordinance, second.
So what does that leave it at? I mean, it doesn't go to the final?
No, it will.
That's
It'll be
part of the
approved,
motion.
and then it goes to the motion.
Was to approve the ordinance and put it in front of the fire. Or, I guess then it comes back and we have to rechange the ordinance? Or it didn't go into effect until they approve it?
It wouldn't go into effect until, I mean, there are the two things I'd say, it wouldn't go into effect until they approve it, and we wouldn't be publishing anything. So as long as you wouldn't publish anything, we wait for their approval, and then after that, if it is approved, then we publish. So that wouldn't trigger anything either.
If it's not approved, then you go back and do it all over again?
You can, so nothing would stop the council from every council amending code and then sending it to the fire marshal for its approval until it got something that the fire marshal agreed with. I would also guess that at that point, I would get some very clear guidance from the fire marshal what they would and would not approve potentially, but there's nothing stopping any municipality from making modifications to the code and sending it whenever, every single session they have. There's no limitations on your ability to do that.
I mean, the fire marshal giving us guidance on what they would and would not approve would be really helpful.
It would be.
I would-
Moved by Scott,
She seconded it.
Susan seconded, Jared,
No.
Susan,
Yes.
Corey,
Yeah.
Scott,
Yes.
Julie.
Yes.
Motion passes 4-1. Next item is committee reports, budget and finance, Scott.
We did meet, the only on the agenda, as we talked about last meeting, was bringing back a proposed plan to ensure that the electric utility reserve fund was at our target of 25% at the end of the year. What was discussed, and I guess a recommendation that came out of that committee was that we have several levers we can pull around leasing the generators that we bought and actually leasing the truck that we bought. So we basically can lease those kind of back to ourselves and spread out the payments. And so that gives us about, $1 million potential that we could go do before the end of the year. So what the committee recommends is we wait till Q4 to see where we're at, because there's a lot of variables in that fund, or before, if it looks like we needed it before. But we wait until second half to see where we're at, and then if if we need to do that lease structure, we'll know what amount we need to do to hit our target, and then we go do that. And if we don't need to do anything, we won't. So that was the recommendation. Comments, feedback?
That's good.
So that's the plan. If we need to change it, we'll change it. Just a couple other notes that Ben from Baker Tilly brought forward, I think were interesting, but in February, city and county sales tax are up 15% over February last year. Cumulative sales tax are ahead of budget to date through February by 17 and 13% for city and county sales tax respectively, so that's all great news. Electric utility fees are 4% under February year over year, but cumulatively 1% for January, February combined over last January, February. So about where we were last year, a little bit higher. Water utility fee, 11% over last year, and cumulatively 9% over the first 2 months. So everything's in the funds looking healthy for the first 2 months. And that's the extent of the report. Next, do we need to meet on Friday for anything? Okay. So we will call the next meeting. What is the next council meeting? So, no, yeah, 10th. So,
Seventh would be the next.
so April 7th, second floor City Hall, 7:45.
We have not met since the last council meeting. We meet again on the 27th, 4 o'clock, second floor City Hall.
Safety, Susan.
We have not met, we'll meet next April 11th at 4.
Public Works, Julie.
Yeah, we met on March 9th, and we got an update on the chip and seal. The bids came in higher this year for that, and normally we combine with Douglas County, so we get a better price on the bids that they send out. The problem is that no one can supply any granite, which is what we use, and so Douglas County canceled all the bids. They suggested that a choice could be trap rock, but they won't use that. Douglas County won't use it. So we're probably not going to be able to do as much chip and seal.
I almost prefer to hold off a year if that's the case.
Yeah.
Instead of
I think they're
Keep everything on a cycle still,
Yeah.
because then you're gonna be like every 50 or every 60 or.
They met with the master gardeners to discuss storage options, and it's still in discussion on the solution for that. There was a police report taken on Clearwave taking city water without permission. The EPA requires identifying all materials used in construction of the water system. They must identify on the supplier side and also the customer side. KDHE requires information be submitted by October 16th of 2024. The Public Works has already started a lead service line inventory. They have dedicated 2 crew members to gather this information from 17 1,780 water customers. The North 400 Road project is nearing completion. The rock was delivered to the Hexham Pond. BTSK will be laying that material as soon as possible around the pond. Orchard Lane project, the condemnation process has begun. There's no update on the Santa Fe crossing. We had a lengthy discussion on the fire code safety, which we just did.
Can you tell us all?
Go into great detail, please.
Go through them.
I have a couple of things that are about this thick, if you wanna read them. Reached an agreement to purchase the used vertical drive assembly for the downtown generator, for $500. The cost can run into $15,000 to $20,000, so once again, our public works guys are saving the city money. Finalizing plans for the foundation for mid-states for the new generators. And our next meeting is April 13th at 9 o'clock.
That's, everything she mentioned. Yeah, that's just exactly right. We got parts off there before, and when this part that they needed come up, they called the people back and said, "You still got that machine sitting up there?" And they said, "Yeah." So when we get these parts, certainly come on up and get them. So it was a good deal. 9 o'clock.
Yes.
We did meet, the strategic planning committee, and we discussed, how to get what we have onto the website in a form that we can bring back to the council for approval. We may want to just handle that in like a work session, like we need to be doing those just for strategic planning. Anyway, so maybe the April work session,
Be April 11th.
early 11th.
We have one.
Yeah, we bring that back with, we need to work with Lynn. She was out and get some ideas from her on what we would put on the website. And then we're still chasing the performance indicators, researching survey options, companies and entities that could go do those surveys for us as part of our performance indicators. And we're still working with the department heads to get at least a single performance indicator on initially so that we can start tracking. So I think we talked about the next meeting on the 31st. Do you have that over here? So make sure I'm not. So the next meeting is scheduled for March 31st, 3 p.m., second floor of City Hall.
City administrator, staff comments?
Nothing further.
Any further council comments?
I have a question. We decided to let, the electric survey thing that came in with a high bid and we tried to let, what is it, KDH?
It was,
Oh, good question.
the,
The rate survey.
rate study?
Rate study.
Great study, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, they said that will be back in the fall. It's,
Right, that's KMEA.
Candy.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Can't do it either.
There's,
I know, it's too many K things.
anyway, I was wondering, do we need to do a rate survey on our water?
So we limited this one down to electric because that's what they do.
Right.
But we could send out a bid for the water side. Baker Tilly kind of gave us that.
They renew all utilities, don't they?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like 1,000.
I think it's 9,000 for the water, I think somewhere 9,000.
Something like that,
Yeah.
pretty close to that.
So I mean, that's something that definitely, Julie, if you guys want to discuss in your committee,
Okay.
if you want to look at doing that, then we can bring it back to the council. Yes. Be helpful. Anything else? All right, we do need an executive session tonight. How long do we need, Glenn? Stay.
Okay. Executive session, how long?
Do we want to start out with 45 minutes?
Let's start with 45. Let's start with 45.
We can leave.
Does anybody need to go to the restroom?
Take a little break, 5 minutes.
Let's take a 5-minute break before we go into executive session.
Take 5.
All right.
45. Okay, just move around a little bit.
They're now
It's all
all
written down for you.
It is there?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
on there.
I thought that's why you had to.
Here it is, nice and handy on black and white.
Isn't that great that
I
somebody?
thought that's what you're doing. I'm used to reading.
I almost teased you earlier when you had to go find the motion earlier. I was like, okay, all right, here's guy.
Every time I make one, someone's got an
Make it
objection to
easy.
my motion.
Make it easy.
All right.
Legitimate objection.
You ready?
No. We're gonna wait for Jerry.
Oh, Jerry's not.
I'm gonna go punch Jerry.
We're out of order. What are they doing?
Actually, we got
Oh,
a
no.
quorum, so technically I could call back into recess.
They're talking, is he in there socializing?
Let's go ahead and call the meeting back in, at 8:44 from a recess. Now, entertain a motion for executive session.
Okay, I move that the city council recess into executive session with city attorney to join the council to discuss a privileged and confidential legal matter,
And outside attorney.
and outside attorney, I'm sorry, yep, sorry,
And Glenn Rodden.
and Glenn Rodden, city administrator. See, I told you I fail these every time. Okay, to discuss a privileged and confidential legal matter of the city pursuant to the attorney-client privilege exception, KSA 75-4319B2. The open meeting will resume in this room at 9:45.
9:30.
9:30? I'm sorry, yeah, 9:30, I'm sorry, that was now 9:30 PM.
Hey Corey, can I get one thing from you?
Yeah,
Can you also add to that, that outside counsel is Jason Pryor?
Yeah.
Is his name?
yep, outside counsel is Jason Pryor.
Thank you.
Second.
We moved in second, all in favor, say aye.
Hi.
I don't what are we doing?
Executive session.
All opposed, no. Motion passes. 4-1 abstain.
I did not read it this time. I'll do it. I'll give it the script. Scott, I need the script that's on paper.
Alright, call the meeting back in order at 9:30. Entertain another motion to
Just
go
say,
back.
we're going back in for 15 minutes.
We got a quorum.
I move that we extend the original motion for executive session for another 15 minutes and return at 9:45.
Second.
Moved and seconded by Julie. We'll give it to her first. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion
Jerry.
passes 4-0.
4-0. You still miss Jerry on that one?
still Jerry.
Jerry's somewhere.
We're gonna give him a yes.
We don't know why, we don't wanna know.
What do they do in that?
Yeah, leave that in there, those stay there.
The code,
Which was it?
it'll go back there. I'll get it.
Alright, we got our
We need another hour and a half.
no meeting back to order at 9:45.
That's Russell's job right
Second, oh, good.
Been moved to second, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Motion passes 4-0.
Good night.
Good night.